shall overcome. We shall overcome. We shall overcome someday. For deep in my heart, I do believe. There's up there, look, see. We shall overcome someday. So today, obviously, as you know, is a reflection on the 5th of October on Duke Street March. And certainly it will be important to reflect back, but most importantly, it is to look forward in terms of civil rights issues today. So the agenda is primarily around how we tackle increasing poverty that's driving many people to despair, the civil rights of women in society, the lack of a bill of rights, the housing shortage, the cost of living, price of fuel, food, especially with low incomes hitting so many people across the north. People who are involved in civil rights are in this room today, and those who we just mentioned, who demonstrated that through peaceful change, through protest, you can make a huge difference. Martin Luther King inspired so many of the civil rights movements both here and internationally, warned against allowing righteous anger and injustice to boil over into violence. He said, "Let's not seek to satisfy our thirst for freedom by drinking from the cup of bitterness and hate. We must forever conduct our struggle on the high plane of dignity and discipline. We must not allow our creative protest to generate into physical violence." That is the history of the civil rights movement that you and many others were involved in.
I've been asked if you could say a few words about actually the Civil Rights March on the 16th of November, as shown in this photograph. And before I go any further, I would like to think, a photograph says more than many, many words. And this particular photograph has been shared very generously. It was taken by a photographer in the city who photographed everything. And the rights to the photograph have always been left freely for everyone. So I'd like to thank Martha Doherty today, whose father, Larry, took the photograph. And and took so many iconic photographs of everything in the city that happened over the last 50 years. So again, I'd like to thank Martha and Doherty family for allowing this photograph to be used. The details of the photograph come back to you later, but just a little bit of history that everybody knows. The events of the 5th of October, Duke Street, were over. It was a complete success on behalf of those who organised. Eamon was here. Eamon was there. People think the 5th of October could have been a disaster. The 5th of October was a complete success because it actually happened what they planned to have happen. If the Stormont authorities had enough brains in their wood, they would just let the thing go. But I think Eamon Malachian is here somewhere, made a proposal to go through the city walls into the diamond, knowing that there's no way on this earth could a unionist government ever let any civil rights or any national march go through the city. So they've thrown a bit of bait, and they, as usual, they snapped the bait up. But after the march was over, there was a little bit of wondering where were people going to go and what happened. But what happened was, somebody from a grapevine somewhere, someone said there's a meeting in the city hotel. But at that meeting, there was a decision to elect a civil rights body for the city. The civil rights body would end up getting named the Citizens Action Committee. There's 14 members on it, and that's 12 of them actually there in the photograph. They were described in some cases as middle class, middle of the road, and middle age. Oh, that's yourself, depends what age you are at the time you say that. But the first decision they had made was they'd have a march, not exactly replicating the march which was taking place before Duke Street. The Duke Street march was never supposed to be in Duke Street, it was supposed to go on Spencer Road. But the police decided which way it's going for their own benefit. So, in order to facilitate the march, they knew at the time there was going to be a very large crowd, and it was very dangerous. So the group itself had decided that rather than have the dangerous situation where a large crowd was going to be faced with a barrier in Duke Street or the bridge, they made this decision. What we'll do, it seemed a good decision at the time, we will go forward as a committee and we will get arrested. 1, 2, 3, 4. Then if you look at the second rank there, you'll see people So we were the substitutes. So once they were arrested, we were supposed to go get arrested too. So the feeling was if there was about 30 people arrested and some of them were prominent, that would have done enough publicity for the day, which was a good idea. But somebody forgot to tell everybody in this crowd of 15,000 that this was a good idea. So someone decided, no, we've had enough. So the crowd broke up, made their way, and in that particular photograph, you'll not know what I was thinking, but I know what I was thinking when he came forward. I was wondering where I'm going to hide, because the barricade was here and they were behind me, and the idea never goes out of my head. But the police in the foresight had actually left enough space in John Street. They knew something was going to break, but they actually left the street adjacent available for people the crowd to go down. Eventually, through the attack from loyalist groups and by the police, the whole group actually made their way into the Diamond. So it was the first time in many years that a civil rights or any kind of nationalist grouping has ever been inside the city walls. So it was the first of many. There was only, prior to that march, there was many marches which were shirt factories, dock workers and all the rest, but this was a organised civil rights march. So this group to me they were far from middle class, middle of the road, and middle age. They were young, they were working class there, they were left wing, they were right wing, there was everything, there was a mixture of everybody, every section of this city. So they reflected cross section of the make of the civil rights movement in Northern Ireland. And social position, age, or it didn't matter, they were all there. I've mentioned, some of the people that are here. I've mentioned some of the people, but I would just like to think that thank all the people who were not the front ranks, all the people who were there behind, all the people in different little hamlets and villages and towns without Northern Ireland, whose names will never be known. They were there, you were there, they were their neighbours. So sometimes I was just going to ask one little favour here. All of those who contributed to a great campaign, and the people who did overcome.
And things. We're here now for an audience with Eamon McCann and Bernadette McAllister. To have such an audience, you would normally introduce the two speakers and say what they did and how they've performed over the years and so on. I don't think that's necessary in the point. At the civil rights marches, we sang "We Shall Overcome." Bernadette, did we overcome?
Can you hear us? Not yet. There's a moving target. Did we, in a very narrow sense, for example, get a vote for every man in the audience? Yes. And Eamon might also pick up on that. So, did we get a degree of reform and a fair point system for social housing? But did we get social justice in terms of the equality of citizenship? If you say the civil rights movement was fundamentally not about the national question, but about equality of citizenship, did we secure equality of citizenship? No, we didn't. No, we haven't. And fundamentally, I do not believe that the infrastructure of the southern state, of the northern state, was built to enable equality of citizenship. It was built to prevent that. So my answer is, to a certain point, within a limited programme of specific reforms, but overcoming is still a work in progress.
Okay. Much achieved, more to be done.
Yes.
Okay, Eamon, did we overcome or were we overcome?
Well, it depends on what you were trying to overcome and what you're trying to achieve, because some people would think, of course, sort of that we overcame. Others might take a different view. I have to say that I disagree with almost everybody who's around there, but they all disagree with almost everybody who's around as well. So there's still sort of a not heated, sort of, but there's still an interesting and sharp debate ongoing about how the civil rights movement in Derry sort of developed. I just sort of say this before we finish, because we could ramble on. I could certainly ramble on for an hour at least, sort of about this. But the characteristics of Derry, absolutely crucial to understanding, not just the October the 5th march. Why did it take place in Derry? What was different about Derry that enabled sort of this march to come out in such determination and in such numbers that it actually made an impact around the world? Well, one of the characteristics of Derry was that the Bogside, the Creggan and the Brandywell area taken together, and they all abut one another. It's a single area really. That was the biggest concentration of Catholics in the whole of Northern Ireland, and had been from the foundation of the state. I mean, the very nature of discrimination in Derry sort of was most exemplified in the shape and the political coloration sort of Derry Corporation, whereas Patrick remarked that we have a 2/3 Catholic majority in terms of people, but we have a 2/3 Unionist Protestant majority on the city council. Now that was something that enraged people. We had Finbar Doherty, he died a couple of months back, Finbar Johnny White, who's died subsequently, Red Mickey Doherty, sort of who died a couple of years back, and a whole series of others, Dermy McClanahan, and so on. We had all been involved, sort of, for example, in squatting people into houses and then defending the houses. They were not letting the cops or anybody else come along here and throw people out. We're involved in standing outside the Dole, sort of on Bishop Street in Derry, passing out leaflets, trying to organise meetings and organise the unemployed. There's a whole series of things going on, and cultural struggles as well. That laid the groundwork for what emerged here as the civil rights movement in Derry, and then that sparked or gave a boost to sort of people who have been, including the Northern Ireland Civil Rights Association, which had been founded in 1966. So those things were not sort of out of the blue. And the situation in Derry, as I say, sort of when it erupted like that. Well, sorry for going on so long, I always do. But we'll maybe sort of get a chance to go into a wee bit more sort of about the discrete politics of the time, as well as the broad brush stuff. But you have to see it in the context of the social and economic situation that people found themselves in, and also the peculiar and particular nature of Derry compared to almost anywhere else. So it's I could talk for hours about this, sort of, but I'm not going to sort of leave it there.
I always say that when you listen to him and you get the urge to organise another march. The point David made there about different views and so on, and the conclusion I would have come to is that we all knew what we were against, but we didn't all agree on what we were for. But that was fair enough. As long as we were against something, we were fine. Now, if some people in the audience would like to ask a question, you are asking questions of two people who are guilty of, by their own admission, of sedition. Are you sure you want to be mixing with these people? Seriously, there's a microphone for you and somebody wants to ask a question, there's an opportunity. Or raise a point or whatever.
Going back to those days of the civil rights and the civil rights movement and the committee thing and the grouping together, which all sort of dissolved in a very quick way when certain things seemed to have been conceded. Was it then, as some in the papers are debating now, really necessary to have all the 30 years, plus if we're still in the middle of a very difficult situation and a very poor situation at the minute, I would think, to avoid the violence? And if you think about this way of moving on the spiral way, we're almost near there again. Could be, could not be. 24 hours a year or what? What do you think needs to be done to ensure that we don't repeat that mistake, which we're another generation away from peace?
The peace was maintained by acquiescence in whatever you were told to do, because of the fear of the violent consequences of not doing it. And that's the same whether that's a personal violence within domestic abuse or spouse abuse or relationship abuse. That the absence of overt violence is maintained by the acquiescence in injustice because of the fear of the violent consequences to yourself. So it's a big question about violence that is not about how do we ensure. It's not within our gift. The gift of a non-violent society in terms of infrastructure is the gift of the powerful. As we can see at the minute, those whose insatiable greed create the inequalities of this world will kill the planet before their addiction to power and greed is ended.
Things today are terrible. The working class people are being walked on. The working class people are being kicked in the teeth. Last Saturday at the Guildhall, Eamon did a brilliant speech about how we have to get the civil rights going again. But how do we put that down to our kids that are, because they have mortgages and because they have this, that and the other, they're afraid to kick back. How do we get it? My mother put it into me. My granny at 84 was in Duke Street, even though people said it was a disgrace if we took her. We didn't take her, she took us. But what do you call it? What I'm saying is, how do we get today's generation to rise up, as Funbar used to say, on our knees? Not Connolly's, but he used to say, on our knees were nobody, we need to get up and we need to fight. And I don't mean like Kate Nash's brother Box. I mean, how do we get them to take to the streets and say, enough is enough? And I would like to pay tribute to what has gone on, but as I say, I don't honestly think, I think Derry actually is still being treated as a second-class city.
Thanks.
Okay, well, Derry has not been treated as a second-class city. I mean, and that's partly to do with just its peripherality, as the jargon would have it now. There's other reasons as well, the capital, the tax capital sort of over to the east, insofar as that happens and so forth. And things are, you know, we are better off now than we used to be in terms of actual goods and a disposable income. But the difference is that in 1868, only the middle classes had fridges. There's only one fridge in Russell Street, Molly Campbell's shop. Nowadays, you had to be rich, in other words, to own a fridge. Nowadays, a person who can't afford a fridge is poor. And they're not poor simply like comparing us, they are poor. It is poverty. What's the social content of the new Ireland which is going to emerge? Nobody knows. What I do know is that unless the working class is organised and fighting its own corner and fighting for its own rights, we could well sort of go into a sort of united Ireland structure that the whole world says, aren't they lovely, aren't they great, look how peaceful they are, but it will still leave the working class tailing behind the rest of society.
When the civil rights struggle came, a meeting was called for people interested in social justice, were against repression, and for the good of the community. My husband Frank and I were invited along. I was proposed and seconded for the Executive Committee of the Civil Rights Association and willingly joined it. I was on the Executive Committee from the beginning to the very end of the Civil Rights campaign, and I was in every single march, including the first one from Coolidge to Dungannon, the Bloody Sunday one, and the last one in Newry. Frank became an ordinary member, as someone had to look after the children. Our eldest son was mentally handicapped and needed caring, but Frank still managed to do a colossal amount of civil rights work as well. They were a great crowd of people who joined the civil rights struggle, from all walks of life and all ages, classes and creeds. Many of them had never taken part in public demonstrations before, and I know never have since, but it did attract the very best type. There were students, musicians, tradespeople, business people, professors, unemployed, solicitors, farmers, factory workers, authors, housewives and many others. I could go on forever. The first chairman was John D. Stewart, who was a humanist and author and journalist by profession. Many people who took part in the struggle suffered in public life. Some had to close their businesses because bigoted and prejudiced people refused to buy from them or hire their services. Lots of people lost their livelihoods and homes because bigots could not see that the civil rights struggle was completely non-sectarian. There were also many women and girls involved, and many family groups would come along and take part. One was a large family from Cliftonville, that's in Belfast, that used to come in their own minibus. They even had their own banner that they made for themselves. There were many young women and girls involved, mostly students from different universities who suffered much. In the march to Perntullett, they were ambushed, beaten all along the way and had to flee across fields and rivers, etc. I am proud to say that one of these young women was my daughter Bridge. Her husband Jerry's here today. Women were the backbone of the civil rights struggle. At the time of the Newry March, all the houses in the town were open and the women would welcome all those who attended the march. The Newry women just handed their homes over and people came from all over Ireland for the rally. There were as many as 20 or 30 people in each house, all made welcome, fed and treated like royalty. It was the same in lots of towns and villages. The women were always to the fore with the food and the shelter for all who needed it. But the women also attended the rallies as well, and many a one, young and old, was battened and stoned. It never deterred them, and they always supported the rallies in their thousands, always brave and practical, and always ready for an emergency. One little old lady from Dublin, an authoress called Hilary Boyle, was on all the marches. She was very tiny and dressed in a very distinguished fashion, and always wore a hat. The Crown forces were preventing people from crossing over a certain area on a particular march, but Hilary was not to be beaten. She hitched up her skirt and climbed over the hedges in a row of houses and through a little field to the main road. There she stood and waved her umbrella at the RUC. The umbrella was bigger than she was. It really was funny, and there was not one thing they could do about it. That was one battle, certainly won in a non-violent manner. There was also another family of girls who supported civil rights. They were from Armagh and included the mother and her 5 daughters. They always wore dark clothes, heavy shoes, and carried haversacks full of sandwiches and flasks of tea, because they said, you never know what sort of situation you could end up in. And they were quite right, because so many funny and surreal things did happen on those rallies. They were nearly all nurses, and one was a school teacher. When people were sick, injured, or felt faint, they were always to the fore with their first aid kits. They were very well known and always there to help, to lend a helping hand. Many of these great women have taken their places in society in different professions and are doing brilliantly as doctors, dentists, solicitors, etc. Some have emigrated and are doing well in different countries around the world. They were a really great crowd of people with the best hearts and intentions in the world. It was truly a better life for all campaign, and those involved were the salt of the earth, and I am proud to have played my part in it. Rebecca McGlade. And I'm proud to come from such good stock.
And I cut my teeth in the civil rights movement. Mrs. Noon in Noon's Hotel in Mara was a good friend of the family in Kevin, and they held, I think, one of the first, if not the first, association meetings. And when we heard about that, especially my father, because these were family events. The whole family had participated, as we've just heard from Dimpna's mother and Bridget's mother, what she said. You went with your father and your mother, you went with your sisters and your brothers on those marches. And no parent would have brought their weans on those marches if they thought they were going to disintegrate into mad rioting. And as Con McCluskey wrote in his book, you know, it was quite a disgrace that those who opposed it, which teaches me a lot about now when I work in Syria and in other places, the apparatus that's used against when people stand up and speak out peacefully, the tactics that are used against them, and how that radicalises people even more, which it did indeed in our case. But you know, it brought me back down memory lane in terms of us setting out and joining up. And I kind of, when I say I cut my teeth in the civil rights movement, and it was a pretty male movement, because the people that were coming to Kilray, eventually after the Nuns Hotel, and eventually down, Ivor Cooper appeared, and you were right to pay tribute to him, because I remember when he was thrown out of the Church of Ireland as a result of the stand he took, and many people rallied around him. But it was a social movement, and so what I did was carried on that social movement, which was, as Eamon rightly said, the mantra of creed not class. And Joan Bias came to Kilray and sang "We Shall Overcome." It was a parish priest actually who invited her to the parish hall for a dance, and we stood there and listened. And I said it recently on the radio, imagine Joan Bias coming all the way. That was the international attention, and that's what also taught me a lesson about the movement, because the television had come. You remember the black and white TVs that were coming into the houses? We were seeing the pictures, and what the police did not realise was hitting people in the groin and people doubling over in pain was flashing across all of the world, and people standing there as they were like this, and the reaction to that. And hence we learned our lessons, and the questions today, if we had had longer, is what you would have done differently.
As a young woman that currently lives in the north, I feel I wouldn't be able to say I have all of my civil and my social rights. I currently live in the most dangerous place in Europe for women. It took until last year for there to be even an agreement that we needed a specific strategy to tackle violence against women and girls. During this time, our neighbouring jurisdictions such as England, Scotland and Wales had developed, launched and relaunched their strategies. So I think you can see how far behind we actually are there. Violence against women and girls takes place in many different forms, and it can happen in any and does happen in every location. We're harassed on the street, we're abused online, we're isolated from our loved ones by partners, and that really only scratches the surface of this issue. So research recently published by the Women's Policy Group showed that 97.2% of those survey respondents thought that we need a specific strategy to tackle men's violence against women. Out of those respondents, 83% had been directly impacted by men's violence. Only 21.4% of these respondents had reported incidents to the PSNI, and the majority at 77% agreed that this was not useful at all. It's awkward, it's uncomfortable, but I have to say it. We have a misogyny problem here, and as a young woman, I see it every day. As a young bisexual woman from the LGBTQ+ community, I am the most at risk of domestic and sexual violence. Now, I'm nearly 24, and I'd say my first experience of violence from men was at age 12 on the street. So it has continued and heightened since then. I've had many more experiences, probably more than I can count on both hands, unfortunately. That's nearly half of my life that I've been subject to degrading, violent and frankly inhumane treatment. Now, I have a lot of privilege. I'm a young woman, I'm white, I'm able-bodied and I'm cisgender. Experiences of misogynistic violence for others and minority groups will worsen as they coincide with experiences of ableism, racism, transphobia, queerphobia, xenophobia and more. Unfortunately, like most issues here, I really don't feel our institutions are willing or able to tackle this issue. I do believe that education is the most valuable tool we have it, and I know it was mentioned that I'm currently training as a relationship and sex education coordinator, and that is why. Every day that we allow young people to go without standardised, comprehensive, unbiased, affirming, inclusive and science-based relationship and sex education, we actively fail and we endanger them. The Committee for the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women, like the title there, recommended that this kind of relationship and sex education should have been implemented back in 2018. They also recommended that an action plan for this should be published and developed, and obviously there has been no movement on that. So at the minute, the quality of relationship and sex education that you receive is still dependent on your school ethos. So if you're in a religious school, you might not get any. It's also subject on your location, as many in Belfast that I've spoken to have had better sex education than we've received in Derry. This means that you may actually not be taught about the likes of consent or coercive control until after you've experienced and been violated by it. In June this year, it was reported that more than 20 PSNI officers were involved in a WhatsApp chat where sexist, pornographic and racist messages were exchanged. And as recent as last week, it was confirmed that 63% of students here have experienced of unwanted sexual encounters. This is just not reflective of institutions that are doing the work to end violence against women and girls. Another issue we can see this delay on is with that of childcare provision. So the childcare cost survey has been conducted since 2010, but there has still been no progress on a full and proper childcare strategy for our region. So at the minute, the average cost of full-time childcare place in the north is £170 per week. This is equivalent to the median weekly household income in Northern Ireland. Now, for us living in somewhere like Derry, where our wages have been historically lower to the likes of our Belfast counterparts, and they continue to be, this poses an extreme barrier for women. For example, difficulties in accessing or affording childcare impacts 58% of mothers' abilities to work compared to 27% of fathers' abilities to work. We're in a cost of living crisis. We have been for a while now, and the lack of action on this is just frankly disgraceful. Both childcare providers and parents and families are struggling financially. This has needed serious intervention for at least a decade, and that links to the fact that the employment rate for women here has been significantly lower than that of men for the past 10 years. Stormont is still only conducting surveys, and they were doing that as little as a week ago. The research speaks for itself. 1 in 3 childcare providers described their current financial position as distressed or struggling, which means that they were at immediate risk of closure, or that they were focused merely on survival for the 12 months ahead. The same 1 in 3 childcare providers now need to raise their costs for the cost of childcare in the middle of a cost of living crisis. So as a result, this turns out that 1 in 3 families are currently spending more on childcare than they are on their mortgage, which is just shocking. I think we really need to do a lot of work to continue to tackle the patriarchal ideals that contribute to things like childcare and all labour within the home being viewed as solely a woman's role or a woman's responsibility. Women are 2 to 4 times likely to be diagnosed with chronic fatigue syndrome. This is yet another health condition that there has been extensive lobbying of the government to provide specialised services for. A clinical lead was successfully recruited in 2018, but there's still no commissioned services. I could go on and on and on about healthcare, education, childcare and violence against women here, but I think it's really important to acknowledge that these points point to a very harsh but clear truth. Women here are still not treated equally. We do not have all of our civil, social or human rights. Our bodies and our lives are nowhere near protected, respected or values. Our experiences and our struggles still go unseen, unheard and unsupported. It's essential that we have conversations like these, so we look at the rights-based movements of the past, again acknowledging the wins, acknowledging the struggles, but thinking and planning for the future and the future we want for all of us.
While actually some people tell us that women did very well out of the peace process, I think Bethany's contribution belies any notion of that. There is a myth that it was only certain women took part in all of the stuff on the peace process. Well, can I tell you, as a Workers' Party activist, the morning after Canary Wharf, a woman from the Popular Unionist Party rang me and said, we need to do something, and that she didn't know me. She rang me and said, we need to do something about this. We need to meet. And she brought up over a group of women from the Shankle Road to meet us in a Workers' Party premises in West Belfast, because actually she believed that women had a role to play and should be playing that role. Every time I talk to that woman now, she laments how women were written out. Somebody talked about them being written out. You know, in reality they were never written in. And the one thing about the Women's Political Forum, when we met first and even talked about, you know, how there's always differences and tensions, we took a conscious decision that we would rather have an uncomfortable honesty amongst each other than a comfortable dishonesty. So the very first things we started to discuss was policing. We did discuss poverty. We discussed all of the things that we needed. They were sick of their children being used as cattle fodder out on the streets. They wanted a change, and they wanted a real change. Now, they were mostly working class women who came together. And at the end of the day, you can say what you want about what women achieved in the peace process, and it's good that some people were recognised and they put murals up. There's not many working class women on those murals, or indeed there's not many working class women that got anything out of it. And we campaigned together for a yes vote, because actually we had hope, and we hoped maybe class politics would come into it, that we would stop the sectarian sort of battle that always goes on. Unfortunately, that didn't happen. And at this moment in time where we stand, sectarianism is as bad as ever was. Orange and green politics is the order of the day. That's the only thing that, I mean, we do. And some of these people who got into Stormont and all of these policies reminded me of a man when I was away at an international thing said, I love these people who's willing to go to another country to fight and overthrow the ruling class, won't do it in their own country. I told him I'd be happy to overthrow the ruling class in my country, but my problem was that actually the violence introduced a new ruling class. There was absolutely no change in any of that where you come from. And they get very annoyed when we're critical. But we have to be critical. If we don't learn from those mistakes, we are not going to advance the class. And Eamon talked about a fridge, and he's probably right. There was a time actually working class people didn't have a fridge. But what the hell uses a fridge do you now when you've no food to put in it? Or you can't afford to turn it on. You know, you can't afford the electricity bills. So, I mean, while we've moved, we haven't moved. I mean, because those things actually are dead. They're dead issues. Bernadette says, well, you know, that part's over. We move on. But it's not over. For many of us, it's not over. This whole discussion about minorities and majorities, if we look at it, the working class are the majority. It is absolutely time we banded together and started operating and voting for people who believe in class politics. Because I tell you, that shower that we've got in now, I mean, they talk about taking financial responsibility. What they mean is they're going to be fiscally conservative. Let's be honest, we had an assembly when they introduced a pay freeze before the Tories did. Nobody likes you mentioning that, but they did. They introduced a pay freeze before the Tories did. They would not properly fund the health service. They wouldn't properly fund the education service. There was actually a disgraceful carry-on. And that brings me on then to United Ireland and women in this new Ireland. If women fare the same as they did under the peace process and the new actually era that we were having in Northern Ireland, look out, girls, because I mean we aren't going anywhere fast. And it's the same conservative forces. I mean, look at the players. Look at the players and take this away from, you know, this the dream that we're getting there. You know, the dream that we leave one imperialist force so we can get into Europe and join the other bigger imperialist force is a falsehood, and it's absolutely ridiculous. There is nothing for ordinary working people in that, and the players will do that. They will say they will introduce the same policies as they've introduced in Northern Ireland. And to be honest, Eamon mentioned actually, and I think Bernadette mentioned the environment. I like actually what the Workers' Party President Ted Tynan said at a demo on the environment. If you want green, vote red.
So became very involved with rights and the whole rights movement and CAJ. Campaign for Administration of Justice, and at the time of the Good Friday Agreement they had a measure in there for a Bill of Rights for Northern Ireland, which was supposed to deal with, when they talked about the two communities, but it was supposed to add rights to the Act, the Human Rights Act, which was to bring human rights into domestic legislation, the Human Rights Act of 1998. So we invited Maggie Byrne from CAJ to talk to the young people in the area about their rights, and ended up writing a Bill of Rights, what you need to flourish as a human being. And there was things like the housing, the education, and also things like that they appealed to them, like Fegs and Beer, which she linked to the international standard of right to social life. And so we put together our own Bill of Rights for the community. And actually, my friend Podgan Drennan, who's a solicitor, she called herself a civil rights solicitor, not a human rights solicitor. And I'm sorry that I never asked her. She died in July, what she meant. So I actually looked up last night what was the difference. And it's sort of saying human rights are the rights that we're born with as human beings. So everybody's entitled to have a roof over their heads. Everybody's entitled to be free of destitution. Everybody is entitled to an education to flourish as a human being, but we don't have those rights. Human rights are what we are entitled to, or equal rights. We're all born equal, but that's not what happens. And civil rights or what the government must do to make sure that we have those rights. And when I read that, I saw why the government are so scared of rights, civil rights, because it's almost like asking turkeys to vote for Christmas. We're asking them to put in powers to ensure that we have our rights as equal human beings, and they are responsible for that. So who would do that? You know, if they have the power and they're just floating along, making money, suiting their own people. It's when you see the extent of the difficulty and you see the whole power balance. So when we started campaigning for a Bill of Rights for Northern Ireland, and we're involved in the Human Rights Consortium, and one of the strongest things was understanding that whole power relationship. So when we went to the education authorities or when we went to the health authorities, we were going there as the right holders and they were the duty bearers, and it changed the whole relationship for us. So it started to become very different. But our political leaders didn't like that, and specifically, they'd say, don't invite me to anything about rights, and they'd say, well, you don't need, rights because we'll give you what you want. And so we didn't listen to them, and we continued to campaign. And under Monica, we did get a forum, a human rights forum, and they came up with a number of suggestions, about rights, and they were in addition to the rights that were there under the Human Rights Act, and they were specific to Northern Ireland. So the things like everybody has caring responsibilities, has a right to appropriate respite from those responsibilities. And they're very, very basic things: rest, leisure, and reasonable limitation of working hours, and periodic holidays with pay, as well as remunerations from holidays. People aren't enjoying those rights, and those are the sort of things that contributed to the increase in the conflict. And, I know that it's not the panacea to all the issues, but it does provide a framework for decision making and ensures that rights don't get moved backwards, so that it's more difficult for government to remove welfare rights. Now, there's another Bill of Rights campaign, which shouldn't be confused. It's the one that the Tories are carrying out at the moment, and they want to sort of undermine the 1998 Act for it's called the Rights Removal Bill, and basically that's been dropped. So we did welcome the fact that it had been dropped. That would have taken away the Human Rights Act and undermined the Good Friday Agreement as well, because that was part of that.
Okay, so I'm going to start with something very controversial. I voted against the Good Friday Agreement. People voted against it from a left-wing point of view and from a peace, because I remember actually I'd only started in Save the Children around the time that the referendum was happening, and literally I was told by my boss to stop arguing about it, that a yes vote, and if you're either for a yes vote or you're for war, you're for continuing the conflict. And the idea that actually it was because we wanted to end the sectarian conflict that some of us were actually against the Good Friday, the way the Good Friday Agreement was set up. It was just something that wasn't, it was just totally, it wasn't accepted. And the thing is that even when you look now at some of the rights that we are supposed to have built in to the Good Friday Agreement, for example, the right that Monica talked about, the right of women to full participation in public life, that might be a right that's enshrined, but it's not a right that's in any way vindicated. Because as others have spoken, particularly what Bernadette and Fiona and Lily said, what we've all been saying, the reality is that today women continue to struggle to make ends meet. They spend so much time trying to make ends meet that they don't really have time for an awful lot to be involved in politics. We don't have childcare. We don't have, Bethany said the price of childcare. We have the most expensive childcare in the UK outside of London. We have the most expensive childcare in Western Europe, us and Dublin actually. Our disability services, the services for people who for families who have a disabled member, are almost non-existent. I mean, we have a situation here at the Western Trust where they took £8 million a year for years from the learning disability services, and we still haven't had it back into those services. And I have to be careful not to get started, because I said I'd be quick, and I could be here for hours talking about all the ways in which our rights actually haven't been delivered. Again. The lack of housing, the impact that has on families. There are families from this city who are being put up in B&Bs out in blooming Ballykelly, and they're supposed to get their children into school here in the city every morning. Right to housing? Anyway, and when we actually talk about housing, and this is something that I go on to my students an awful lot about, when you look at the way that the housing executive delivered really good public housing here, and the way the private sector, if you want to see a graph of what the private sector was like in 1972, starting up here, and then it dropped right down through the 80s as the housing executive built more and more public housing, and good quality public housing. And then you see from the 1990s onwards, Thatcherism really, when Thatcherism started to impact here, but also unfortunately very much in line with the peace process, you see the proportion of rented houses that are actually in the private rented sector going right up. And today there are more people renting in the private sector than renting in the public or social housing sector. And of course the reason we talk about social housing these days is because an awful lot of what's being built as social housing isn't actually public housing. It's social housing associations which are actually private.
There's been the conversation all day long about poverty and the cost of living crisis, health crisis, housing, etc., etc. And there's people out there who are in a position where they have to work 2 and 3 jobs and more maybe, and still can't afford to make ends meet. I mean, up in the lots of protests and everyone comes back to the same situation. We can march on the street, but what will happen? What will we achieve? It's very frustrating, you're racking your brains. I'm happy to go on a rent and rate strike and not pay my electric bills. I think it would humiliate and draw attention of how dolls and how fellas could do that and be prepared to go to jail. You'd get free electric and free food anyway, it'd be great. But I do think, I'm serious, I do think it's maybe a movement, even if it's a small movement of 20 or 30 across the region, to say we're not going to pay. Well, how embarrassing would that be to turf us into jail?
Thank people that organised today. I'm really standing on the bag side, but certainly supporting it. And especially to think about and remember people like Bridget Bond, Cathy Harkin, Madge Davison, Betty Sinclair, and Edwina Stewart, and all the women that are not with us today, And when actually people were talking about the history of women, and you only have to look at Armoured Cars and Tanks and Guns, the song, and the fact, the helpless mothers watched, they were helpless, and now all the men will stand behind the men behind the wire. And actually, I didn't know, but there is a loyalist equivalent to that. It's quite different, but it's their equivalent, which the man really wants to be in Long Kesh with his mates, that's where he wants to be.
I just want to start by first of all echoing Linda's comment of thanks to the organisers of this event, which I think was a very necessary event. And I hope I don't, it's by no means casting aspersions on any of the earlier speakers who were very interesting indeed, but I have to say that I think this panel has been particularly inspiring this afternoon. And as the point was made, it wasn't just in Belfast and Derry, which tend to be the places that are picked out, but in small hamlets, towns, villages right across Northern Ireland. Brave people who took brave decisions and who stood up when that was needed. It's important that we commemorate that. And it's also important that we take this opportunity to reclaim that struggle and to free it from the false narratives that are now being imposed on the civil rights movement. I think that's an important part of what's happening today. The second important matter is the continuing struggle for civil rights, and that was exemplified by all of the speakers who spoke this afternoon. All those necessary struggles in which we should continue to be engaged and encourage more and more young people to become involved in the civil rights struggle. Because we heard today about all the deficiencies that exist in our society. The lack of proper access to healthcare, to education, students being unable to afford university, reproductive rights, the lack of proper housing. All of those are proper struggles that we should be involved in. But the thing that we have to remember, and I think it has come through as an underlying theme in many of the contributions that have been made today, is this: these are not accidents. This isn't some flaw of nature that we have cutbacks in public services, that we have people unemployed, that we have people on zero-hour contracts. This is a deliberate strategy. This is deliberate, and it is planned, and it is systemic. And until we point out those issues, we will never be able to overcome the obstacles. The crisis that we face is part of the system that we live in. And until we attack and ultimately destroy that system, these problems will recur and recur. We live in a society where the creators of wealth, the working class, are the people who are deprived of that wealth. And until we create a system where we put in power those workers, where we create a system of workers' power and we build a socialist system, these meetings will take place continually. And I think we need to recognise that those are the obstacles we have to overcome in our struggles for civil rights. Thank you.
Yeah, well, I know we're talking about civil rights movement that took place a number of years ago, but there's another civil right that we're seeing undermined, and that's the National Health Service. We now have a situation where some years ago we had PFI and all that, but now we've got private hospitals owned, and I mean owned, and run by people who work in the National Health Service. I have a situation where in January this year I was diagnosed with carpal tunnel syndrome, which means I've no use in my hands. I had an injection that didn't work, and the doctor told me, if this don't work, you'll need surgery, but that could be a 12 month or 2 years away. But then you can pay £1,000, he says, although I didn't want to tell you that. So it didn't work, so they referred me to another doctor, and I've had 2 more injections, and he said if they don't work, he'll need surgery. I said, no, I've looked on a website and it's 13.5 months waiting list. I said, that's after you've seen the consultant. The Kingsbury's Hospital would charge me £2,400, and I'd paid 40 odd years into national insurance. I felt like saying, why don't you take it out of that? You know, but we're seeing now the disruption of the National Health Service. And, you know, I heard Mary Lou MacDonald saying, in a new island, we'll have an all-island public health service. And the wee fella, Neil Richmond, Fine Gael TD, said, yes, and we'll have access to private medicine as well. So I can see what we're now seeing is the beginning of the end. Like I said, Paddy Murphy wrote in Irish News, he blamed an Iron Bevan for the privatisation, and I thought, right, let's have a look at this. And yes, an Iron Bevan, when he said, I had to stuff their mouths with gold, it didn't just mean salary, it meant the fact that they could use private practice, which they did in NH hospitals. Now they've gone further. Those who own Kingsbridge in Belfast have a facility in Letterkenny, they have a facility in Sligo, and they have a facility in the northwest. And I think it's something now that at the end of the day, what we might end up with is a national service that is a shadow of what it were in 1947 when it were brought in. And I think it's very important that we pay a lot of attention to that. I think that's a rallying point for both sections of the community in this area. Thank you.
A question was asked earlier about the role of our young people and how do we involve them into the civil rights movement. I would also go back to what one of the panelists has said about human rights, you see. And so the truth of the matter is that we understand the limitations of us as grandparents or parents to tell our own children in our own household, because there's limitations here, you see. But there is no space whatsoever in our community where our young people can gather, meet, discuss, besides the pub or a cafe that is closing at 5 p.m. You see? So the reason why I'm saying that is because I really believe that the young people need these spaces to be able to not only read their reality like we are doing, but also look at the horizon, like dear Bethany you were sharing. You know, I'm actually I'm talking to like-minded people right now, and I founded an organization called NetLove. I invite you to look at it, netlove.org. And I'm trying to put together a delegation to go to Paris, France, where they have put something called a Youth HQ. I have no idea if it's going to work in Derry, but there are some people in Galway, in Dublin, and Letterkenny that are interested. And we're going to put a short delegation, a small one, and say, there's a huge building in Paris across the Louvre that was transformed into something called a Youth HQ. And what do? Their needs are met, but it's also a space where the young people can talk and can consult and can see how can we contribute towards the betterment of our community. And I will end with this. I don't know about a socialist government. I don't know about a communist one. I don't know about a religious one. I don't know about an atheist one. But I believe in one that is a virtuous one, you see? One that believes that the truth of the well-being of one should be the well-being of all, and the discomfort of one should be the discomfort of all. For me, this is the most important, you know? And I would hope that our young people today, if they have a space, they can see that. Whatever belief they have, that this is actually the backbone, you know? And I'm going to end with the words of an Iranian poet called Rumi, and he said, "Raise your words, not your voice. It is rain that grows flowers, not thunder." Thank you.
Like, I just want to say, young people are involved and engaged. We are doing this work, but there is issues and there is, you know, added struggle. Like, I know the last speaker there touched on how we have no spaces. The space is only, you know, the pub or a cafe that's closing at 5 p.m. It's not as if any young people today, any of my friends or peers, are able to have our own house. Not as if we can invite an organising committee over to house with parents and children and grandparents and all of that. But I do really want to stress that young people are engaged. We are having these conversations. I think sometimes the structures here, and I will say, you know, I think particularly religious education stops young people from having these conversations. I come from, you know, a Catholic education background. I was in Catholic education until I was 18, and it was there I started to have conversations about, you know, the civil rights we're facing today, LGBTQ plus equality, and reproductive rights and abortion rights and reproductive justice only being some of them. But I think, you know, we have to look at how we engage with each other. You know, there is still a segregated education system here. I didn't really have any friends from a Protestant or a Unionist background until I went to university, and, you know, that was out of no fault of my own. I wasn't asking anyone, you know, are you Protestant? Don't go. You know, it's not like that. And I think, you know, a lot of our young people are only equipped and empowered to become engaged actually once we age out of the secondary school system.
There wasn't a mass movement. There was no mass movement. It wasn't getting anywhere. Civil rights, NICRA, changed all that, because NICRA brought everybody together under the mantle of Northern Ireland Civil Rights Association. It was an organisation formed with the objective of reforming the Northern Ireland state. It wasn't a Republican group, it wasn't a nationalist group, it wasn't a unionist group, it wasn't a socialist group. It was purely a group, secular and anti-sectarian, anti-discriminatory. It was formed to democratise the Northern Ireland state.
Marion actually is the person who put the most fire into my belly, for the want of a better word, and who made me the socialist I am.
We shall overcome. We shall